Hi, it's Terry Smart from Chestnut Products, and we're back in the studio for another colouring demonstration. But there's something missing. Hang on a second. Hey, it worked. How was that?
Yeah, well, it was easier than the Dartford Tunnel.
Wish it really was that easy. Anyway, Stuart, it's great to have you back in the studio, mate. What are you going to be doing for us today?
Oh, thanks, Terry. Today I'm going to be doing rainbow waxes.
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to this one because I love what you do with them. So whenever you're ready, we'll get started.
Thanks, Terry. I'll get started right now. Okay, so the first colours I'm going to be using are the range of blues and the ivory. And before I start, I've just put some gloves on because the rainbow wax is very brightly coloured. You can get it on your fingers quite easily. A few tips about usage. Best practice is not to put your fingers in there. You don't want your skin oil mixing with what's in the pot. So I always take a little dollop of it out. If I'm going to be using one solid colour, I might just use the same brush to dip in and out, but generally I'll take a dollop of it out and use that. Now, my preferred way of applying it is with a cheap toothbrush. So I just take a dollop of the wax out, put it onto a palette. I've probably been a little bit generous with that amount, but that'll get us started. Now, you can use them straight from the pot. They're an acrylic based product, so you can actually water them down. You can get some very interesting effects with them watered down as well. But they have a wax sheen to them which you can buff up to a really lovely shine. So I'll just put a solid blue on the outside edge here, and for me, I like working with them on textured surfaces. So this surface has been textured, and I suppose something a bit wave-like in texture. You can see actually a little goes a very long way, so I've definitely put too much out on my palette for this small blank. You can apply them over bare wood, but it's better to have the wood sealed. Now this has been sealed with acrylic sanding sealer, the spray-on one. There, that's hinting at something to come a bit later. That nice veined effect that you can get. So I'm just brushing this right down into all of the texture. I want all of it covered. And like the other videos in this series, I'm just going to be concentrating on the colour application, not turning. There, give it a look, make sure you've got that all the way down to the bottom. Takes very little time to get it on. Right, just going to give that a bit of a brush, running my brush with the texture, helping to dry it in place. And it gives me a last opportunity to make sure I've covered all of the wood. There's a bit of a build up in the edge there, I'll just spread that out. So come on to the end and have a look down and see that you've got it all covered. There are one or two places it's a little thin. Okay, so that's the first coat. And you might think, wow, that toothbrush is no good for anything now. But warm soapy water, it'll all wash out. It'll be as good as new. Although I wouldn't recommend brushing your teeth with it ever. Right, to bring that shine up, you need to dry it off. The best way for doing that is to use one of these brushes. Just brushing across. Reminds me of the old days when I was in the Air Cadets and had to get my boots nice and shiny on the toe caps. Now, if I was only going to put one colour on, I'd probably leave it to dry. But I want to blend some other blues over this or into it just to make it a little bit more interesting in texture. Yeah, so that's coming on very nicely now. Now I said that I like using it on textured surfaces, but you can get some wonderful effects on smooth wood as well. And on smooth wood, the application process would be exactly the same. Put it on with a little toothbrush or wipe it on with a cloth. You can then use your cloth or a brush to buff it. And on smooth surfaces, you can buff it with the lathe running as well. But that's pretty much there, I think. Again, you can see I've transferred quite a bit of colour onto the polishing brush, but that again will wash out with warm soapy water. Now there are another couple of blues in the range, teal and aqua blue. So I will just do a little bit with the aqua blue and the teal. New brush for each colour. I'm only going to need a small amount of this, so I'm just going to take a very little bit on the brush directly from the pot. Now, if I wanted to take some more from that, because this is going on over this other blue, I wouldn't take it directly onto the brush. I'd scoop some out. I want to avoid contaminating the colours with the other colours. And now this, I don't want to go everywhere. I want a little bit of it in some of the areas, and then spread it out. There we go. I'll be looking at another variation of this technique a little later on. Now, another way to dry it off with a bit of paper towel. I'm just going to wipe that in. It's subtle, but it's clearly there's a different colour going on. Just want to get it dry. You can see it comes off on the paper very easily. Buff, buff, buff. Right. And with the texture, it really catches the light differently as you move it around. Okay, we'll get on to the aqua blue, which is probably the most vivid of the blues. Another little toothbrush. Again, I'm not going to need more than this amount, so I'm going to just use it straight from the brush. If you find that using it straight from the brush means that you get a big clump of it in the one place and you don't want that, of course put it off in your palette, wipe some of that excess off, but that's plenty. I'm looking at there's some of the gaps where the other blue has gone, going in between there. Bit thick in places, scoop it up, move it round. And because this is acrylic, you can also mix it with the paints. You can get a little messy when you start diluting it. Best thing to dilute it with is the airbrush thinner. Okay, that's enough. I'm going to use another part of this same paper towel just to give that a bit of a dry. And so the difference really with this, as opposed to maybe the paints, for example, is the sort of softer feel you get from a wax finish. Over the top of this, because it's acrylic, you can put some lacquer on it. If you've got a thick coat like this, probably the best finish over the top would be wax. Wood wax 22, and then maybe some microcrystalline wax as a harder wax over the top of all of that. Getting a bit of paper stuck there on some of the texture, but that's easily brushed off. And putting on those other colours has allowed a nice metallic sheen to appear. Now, for the next colour I'm going to use ivory, and this is just going to be used to try to pick out the high points. So I only need a very little bit of this. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. You can do it straight from the brush. But obviously I've got a sort of a lump of it on there. If I go on straight away with the brush, then there's every possibility that I'm going to end up with a big lump of it somewhere. So a way to avoid that, if I scoop off most of it into my palette, so I've got a drier brush, I want to go across the texture just to catch those lines. So that's one way, and that's just picking up little flecks of the white. Keep rotating it. And then that really helps to see the depth in the texture. When you've got solid colour like this in texture, sometimes the texture can disappear from view. But if you pick out the high points, it accentuates that depth. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is to use a gloved finger, and that I find that gives me a bit more control with where I'm going. So just wiping that on, that's probably my preferred way of doing it. If you don't mind getting, well, it's not your finger dirty, is it? It's the gloved finger. So let's get some more out and finish off picking out those high points. Again, I'm not going to stick my finger in there, just take out a little scoop onto my palette, seal it up. You know how shavings get in every pot of wax in your workshop if you don't seal them up. So bit on the finger, gloved finger, and just run across the top. A little bit more. So that's really picking out the top of the texture very nicely, and we'll give that a little bit of time to dry off. Don't forget to look from different angles to see that you've got it covered appropriately. I think that's just about enough. Again, you don't have to do this in the lathe. Certainly a piece this small, you could easily do it in your hand or on your workbench. You wouldn't have to do so much stooping as I'm doing. Now, the more you work the wax over the top of the other colours, it will pick up and mix with those colours. So if you want to keep the clarity of the ivory, just only a few strokes, a few passes with your finger before you reapply, get some fresh colour on, and then go over the top. So you can see perhaps around here we've got wax lines running across the texture in the bottom of it where I was doing it with the toothbrush. And like I said, I think this is a better way of doing it to get picking out that top of the texture. You can dry brush with that, but you need to use a different sort of brush. The toothbrush is bristles are a bit too stiff for that, really, I think. Now, if I buff that now, I'm going to move around that ivory a little bit too much for my liking. So we'll give it a few minutes to dry, and then I'll buff it with a piece of dry paper towel, and that will really bring out the shine of the wax. Right, so it's had about 10 minutes or so to dry, so I'm just going to polish the top with a little bit of paper towel, and that will bring the shine up, and that will be the end of the colouring of this piece. One of the advantages, of course, of using a brush to polish is you don't get bits of paper flaking off. There we go. Right, clean bit of cloth just to give it a final wipe. And then we'll take it off the lathe and have a look at what we've got. See there how dry it is, nothing coming off anymore. Get the chuck key. So lots of lovely shine and shimmer from that ivory on the top. Almost a hint of green in some places with the teal wax going on in there as well. And again, like the other videos in this series, it's not about doing the turning, but if I were to turn that out, again, you'd see that colour really pop when it's against a defined edge of wood. But that's fun and quite easy to achieve. So I'm going to show a variation of this in the next little bit of today's demo. And I'm going to go red this time. Right, so I'm going to use copper and red on the next piece just to show another way of combining the colours. You don't have to mix one over the top of the other. You can get a nice gradient effect working. So we've got copper here. Get a brush to put it on with. And again, I'm probably going to get enough on the brush in one go without me having to put it back into the copper. But if I do, that's not a problem because I don't have any other colours that it would be contaminated by. So just going to take a small amount off like that, maybe a little bit more generous than that. That should probably be enough. So we'll have copper on the inside, and I'm just distributing what's on the brush first, so it's a bit more even in coverage. But again, I'm not overly bothered about it being absolutely even. But I do want copper going all the way to the inner edge. And spreading it out, but I'm leaving some space to come back with some red to spread to the outer edge. There we go, nearly done. And as I'm working the brush around, rubbing it more, it's helping to bring some of the shine out. I'm looking for areas where it's in a bit thicker a clump and soften that into the wood. I don't want to overwork it though and end up with wiping it all off. So I'm pretty happy with that coverage, but round here it needs to be a little bit more saturated. So I'm going to put a little bit more on my brush. And again, I can go back into this colour with the same brush because I haven't got it contaminated with any other colour. I think I might just deposit it in the middle there and then I can work it in to those areas more easily. And if you get fed up with cleaning out palettes, maybe that's a little tip that will help you out. Right, now let's spread some of that to the outer edges, but decreasing saturation, just providing a soft feathered edge here to work the red into. Right, I think that will do for demonstration purposes. Right, red next. So another little toothbrush in evidence. I'm going to take a clump out and put it in my palette in a spot that hasn't been used. There we go, that will do. Now, I don't want to mix it in with the copper. I want the one to lead into the other. So I'm going to start off round the edge, brushing this in. And again, you don't have to do this on textured wood. You can do it on a smooth surface as well. And if you wanted to speed it up a little, the coverage, like I said earlier, you can thin this down with the airbrush reducer. And then you can apply it with, almost as a paint. Oh, yeah. Just working our way round. It's not something you have to hurry. Take your time doing it. Make sure that you're getting the wood covered. And then once it's dry, although it looks a little matte under the lights at the moment, once it's dry we can give it a buffing with the hand polishing brush again, and then we'll get a nice sheen going on. It'll really raise the shine. There we go, nearly there. When you're colouring a textured surface, I've done most of the colouring on this side, which means that I'm only seeing really one side of the texture. Over on this side, if I colour, I'm seeing the opposite side of the texture, and that way I can make sure that I've coloured all the way down into it. There's a few areas where the copper meets the red that I'm actually going to come back in with the copper on. So you might be seeing some areas here where the coverage is not very thick from the red. And I think I need to go back, just give the copper a little bit more space on the surface. Okay, look at it from the end. So looking end on, I can see there are some bits here that aren't really covered. Let's get some more of that red in the brush. And that's probably it for the red. So the copper has only had copper on it. I'm going to get one more scoop out. And again, I'm going to leave it in the middle. Now I want to work the copper out into those areas where the wood is still showing. Work it into the red. If I haven't taken enough copper, the next time I take some out, I'll need to do it with a clean end of a brush, because this is now mixing with that red. Okay, let's blend them together a little. Okay, I'm going to give that a little moment to dry off. And while that's drying, oh, I can stand up straight. Right. Actually, I've just spotted a bit there, needed a bit more red. There we go. Right, that's it. So, hand polishing brush, and we'll buff that up and get a nice shine on it. In fact, you don't even need to buff it while it's in the lathe. That stops some bending over, doesn't it? I get a much better view of it this way. And I'm brushing with the texture rather than across it because I want the brushes to go all the way into the bottom. So we've got a very nice subtle gradient from copper to red. And without the buffing, it doesn't really come to life. So this is an important part of the process. There, so you should be able to see that lovely shine now, really catching the light. If you want to bring some stronger contrast to it, then you can, over the top of that, catch the high points with one of the darker waxes. You could even be bold and go with something like bright blue if you wanted something really in your face. What should I use? Should I do half and half? It's a demonstration after all. It'll just show you some possibilities. And then we can decide which is the better colour to put over the top. So I have some charcoal here to hand. Now again, I want this to catch the top. I don't want it to cover all of the texture. So I can give it a go with a different sort of brush where I can just catch the top. So let's get a bit more space up here. Push those to the side a little. And I'm going to put some of this in my palette. So this is charcoal. So I use the end of the brush just to scoop some out, get some on my brush. Now, to stop it being too loaded with colour, I can wipe some of that off. And then I can come back and pick some of that up if I need more. So I want to brush across the texture. Oh, that was far too heavy. Far too heavy there as well. This bit should probably be perfect. Yeah, there we go. That's the kind of look that I wanted. Just very light hand over the top. Where that's gone very wrong, that bit. Never mind. I'm here to make the mistakes for you. So I still had a bit too much on my brush. And I'm running out of room to try bright blue on it now, aren't I? Don't worry, I'll come back to that bit in a minute. Right, now we're not going to employ any camera trickery and try to hide those mistakes. That's what happens if you put too much on. But round here where I've had less on the brush, it really does help that texture to come to life. This bit has got much more depth to my eye than round here where we haven't picked out the high points. But I'm going to get some bright blue to put that on there because I think that's going to make it a really bold statement. So when I say bright blue, I'm going with the aqua blue. And I've got another brush, similar, much fuller brush. It's had no colour on it. We've seen how little is actually needed. So there we go, hardly anything on that brush at all. Again, put the lid on. We don't have a workshop full of shavings here, but it will find its way into there if you leave the lid off in your own workshop for sure. Right, just wipe off some of that excess. So I've got a very little area left to try this blue. But I think I prefer the blue actually to the charcoal. So experiment, try things out, pick a colour and you think that's not going to work, try it anyway. If I carry on brushing, it's going to blend with the red and the copper underneath. it'll lose its clarity and become a bit murky looking. So don't overwork the waxes. Give it some time to dry, then you can buff the top with a bit of cloth and that will keep the blue shiny and clear. So that needs a few minutes to dry off before the buffing can take place. So the blue and charcoal have had some time to dry now. Bit of safety cloth, just give them a bit of a buff. And again, I just really want to catch the colour on the top to bring the shine up. It's not about blending it in and mixing it with the red or the copper. You can see a little bit coming off there, so it's just about ready for buffing. And I'm not going to buff that blue again. I'm going to move on to the charcoal. Again, there's the mistake where it was put on too heavily. So I buff this lighter area first, just to put a bit of shine on the very top. Okay, now in there, if you were very assiduous with your buffing, you might be able to buff some of that out. If it was a prize piece and you wanted to get rid of that, just get a little bit of reducer on your cloth, and then you can gently rub in those areas and it will remove some of it. You might need to repair the colour underneath. For the sake of our demo today, I'm going to leave that as it is, and we'll get you a close-up shot of the effect. Right, so that's number 2 done. There's one more to have a little bit of a play with, slightly different texture. So I'll get that on the lathe and then we'll get waxing again. Okay, so for the final piece in this demonstration, I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to combine the waxes and the iridescent paints. Now, if you wanted to put iridescent paint over the top of the waxes, that might be a little problematic, but put underneath them is no problem at all. So I'm going to go with some of the red first to colour this piece completely, and then I'm going to pick out the highlights of the texture with a couple of the rainbow waxes. So I'll give that a little bit of a shake and get some out in my palette. Find a cleanish spot in there. Okay. And load up the brush. Now, you don't need to be neat or very fastidious with this. You're just really working it down into all of the texture to get a good covering. I may well come back and do 2 coats of this. Again, the wood has been sealed with acrylic sanding sealer. So that's got something for the paint to sit on rather than be absorbed into the wood. And the texturing, I've got different patterned texture on this side. So we've got some deep scooping cuts, and then across the top of that some shallower radial cuts, which should be picked out when we put the waxes on. So I want to work this down. I've got to make sure the red gets down all the way into the bottom of the texture, because that's where the red is going to show most. And again, because we're focusing on the colouring, it's going to look a little messy in the middle, but you just have to imagine a nice clean bowl cut out in the middle of it. So that first coat is just about done. Come on to the end, find spaces or places where there isn't any coverage at the bottom, and get the paint in there. I know that some people may be a bit reluctant to get into colouring and texturing, and certainly when you combine texture and colour, you can think you're making an awful mess of something, but you've got to just persevere and keep going. See what the true end result is, At the moment, this might be looking, well, that's a bit of a mess, isn't it? But perseverance is often rewarded with this kind of work. Right, that's just about done. One or two spots where it's a little, coverage is a little shallow. So leave that to dry, and then when it's dry I'll make a decision about whether it needs a second coat, but it won't take very long to apply that if necessary. But we'll give that a few minutes just to dry off before we move on to the next stage. Right, so the first coat has dried. I'm just going to darken it up with a second coat, just make sure I've covered all of the wood, especially down into the bottom of the texture. The second coat is always quicker than the first one. Here we go. And it's the bottom of the texture I really want to make sure is covered. That's where the red is going to live and stand out. So I'm getting right down into the bottom of the texture. We've got texture running this way, but we've also on top of that got shallower texture. So I want to brush this way too to make sure that texture is all filled with solid colour. As I say, the second coat doesn't take nearly as long, and that is it done. So in the deeper texture here, I don't want the paint to have puddled, so I'm just working that around with my brush, spreading it a bit thinner, and we're at that stage where we need to give it a few minutes to dry again. Right, so our second coat has dried, and now we're going to put the wax over the top, and that will really help the texture to stand out. I'm going to start off with the bronze. I'm going to use the end of my brush just to take a scoop out. There we go, that's plenty. Again, keep putting your lids back on. I'm going to put that just into the corner of a palette here. And what's left on the outside of the brush, or the top of the brush, I'm just going to put on my finger here. Right. So I can see what I'm doing. I want to go over the top lightly. In the last one we did it with a dry brush. You can use a finger. I want to go against the texture. So round here, those edges that might be lost on camera are really getting picked up now by the wax. I start on this outside edge and work my way round, keeping a flat finger so it's catching the high points of the texture, and that's why it was so important to get the red so solid lower down. Now, because it's easier to keep your finger flat, this sometimes can be easier if you're a ham-fisted dry brusher like I proved myself to be a few moments ago. There, so there are some areas where I haven't got to yet with the bronze. Let's get a bit more. Keep turning it round, having a look. Keep stepping back from your work to make sure you're not missing anywhere. And the bronze really does make a nice contrast with the red, but I feel we can add a little bit more drama with a little bit of charcoal. So in terms of coverage, the red is covering all of the blank. The bronze is then going to be the second most used colour. And the charcoal I'm going to use a little more sparingly, just to put a third colour on, which helps to, I think, finish it off. Two colours sometimes isn't enough. Right, so just going to give that a little buff with a piece of safety cloth. Again, keeping the cloth flat, and that will help to dry off the wax, and it will also help to stop the charcoal blending so readily with the bronze. Okay, I can also try and clean off the fingers of my glove. So, last of all, the charcoal. I'm going to put some on the end of a brush. That's probably enough, but for safety I'll take a little more. So you can just use the back of the brush to get it onto your finger. And for this, as I say, I want this a bit more sparing, probably just around this edge, just to darken it, make it a little bit more defined. Pushing it outwards. And then a little bit in the centre. You don't have to use the end of your toothbrush like this. You could use a lollipop stick, a craft stick. But just another little wipe and we're almost done. So this, I think, darkens it. It makes the texture stand out more strongly, certainly down here, these swooping cuts. But I feel I've really only scratched the surface of what you can do with the waxes. Okay, so that's enough of the charcoal. We do of course need to buff it to bring the shine up. Where's my buffing brush? So here we go. I'll just give this a buff and that really will be the finishing touch. To protect that surface, of course, you may want to add some more wax. Wood wax 22, microcrystalline wax. Probably would need to brush it on though because of all of that texture. Really work it down into the gaps. And again, like the other pieces I've made, it really will come to life when the middle is turned out, but that's beyond the scope of today's video. Right, let's get that off the lathe and have a look at it. Right, so I can see what I've done. Yep. So it gives almost like a metallic shine to it. That charcoal and the bronze against the red here. The vividness of the red obviously comes through, meets the eye first. But without this wax highlighting the texture, you really wouldn't see it nearly as clearly as you do. That's another great way of using the waxes. There are lots more ways too, but hopefully this will be enough of an inspiration for you to go and give the waxes a go yourself.
Stuart, thanks for that. It's brilliant as always. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure you've given lots of people lots of different ideas and inspiration on how to use the rainbow waxes and using it with the iridescent paint as well. Absolutely brilliant. Really did enjoy that. What's your favourite?
Oh, I do have a favourite, but there's a bit I like in all of them. I really like the blue over the red and the copper there.
Yeah, that's come out surprisingly well.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure when you did it, but
yeah,
brilliant.
The charcoal we'll say less about. On here, the combination of the three colours and the texture, I like that.
Yeah.
But overall, it's the blue one.
I knew it would be, because it always is, but no, it's a good choice. I love it. I'm going to assume that, as always, you're happy to answer any questions if people have them?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got any questions, put them below and I'll answer them.
Fantastic, mate. Thanks once more. Should we get going?
I think so.
Yeah, come on then.
3, 2, 1. Now to dry that off and to get the sheen, I buff it with a hand polishing brush. You get a very nice grip with this hand. Oops. So hand brushing.
Hand polishing pole.
Hand polishing brush.